Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. Welcome to Sci Fi Saturday. Tonight on the Hidden Corners, we are reading one of my favorite Twilight Zone episodes called The Shelter by Rod Serling. Outside it was a summer night. Broad-leaved oaks and maples caught the lights of the old stately houses that flanked the street. A breeze carried with it the 8 o'clock noises of television westerns, kids asking for glasses of water, and the discordant tinkle of a piano. In Dr. Stockton's house, the meal had been eaten, and his wife Grace was bringing in the birthday cake. The people at the table rose, applauded, whistled, and somebody began singing, "Happy birthday to you," and then they all joined in. Bill Stockton blushed, put his head down, held up his hand in protest, but down deep he felt incredibly happy. Marty Weiss, a small, dark, intense little guy who ran a shoe store on Court Street, got to his feet and shouted out, "Speech, Doc! Let's have a speech!" "Before he blows out the candles," Harlow announced pontifically, "I should like to propose a toast, since no birthday celebration is complete without a traditional after-dinner address." Martha Harlow gave him a Bronx cheer, and Marty's wife, Rebecca, tried to pull him down by the back of his coat. Harlow leaned over and gave her a big, wet kiss, and they all shrieked with laughter. Then he held up his glass again, waved off Grace's protest that first her husband should blow out the candles, and addressed the group. "And now to get down to the business at hand, that of honoring one Dr. William Stockton, who's grown 1 year older and who will admit to being over 21. Again they all laughed, and Grace leaned over to hug her husband. Harlow turned toward Bill Stockton and smiled, and there was something in the smile that made them all become quiet. "We got this little surprise party together, Bill," he said, "as a very small reminder to you that on this particular street and in this particular town, you're a very beloved guy. There isn't one of us in this room who hasn't put in a frantic phone call to you in the middle of the night with a sick kid or a major medical crisis that turns out to be indigestion. And you'd come out with that antique medical bag of yours, one eye closed and half asleep, but without even a moment's hesitation. And while things like this never appear on a bill under services rendered, you made a lot of hearts beat easier, and you've eased more pain than I'd ever like to feel." He grinned, then winked at the people who were listening so intently. "And there also isn't one of us in this room," he continued, "who hasn't owed you a whopping bill for a lot of months, and I expect there are plenty of us on this street who owe you one now." There was laughter at this, and Marty Weiss banged on his glass with a fork. "What about his hammering at all hours of the night?" he called out. "That's another thing we owe him for." Jerry Harlow joined in the laughter, then held up his hands. "Oh, yes," he said with a smile, "the good doctor's bomb shelter. I think we might as well forgive him for that, despite the fact that what he thinks is far-sightedness on his part is a pain in the neck to all the rest of us on the street. The concrete trucks, the nocturnal hammering, and all the rest of it." They all laughed again, and Bill Stockton looked around quizzically, knife in his hand. "I can tell you all this," he said. "You don't get any cake until the windbag is finished." "Why, Bill Stockton," his wife said with gentle admonition. "Bill's right," Marty interjected. "Go ahead, Jerry. Get it over with while we're all still sober enough to eat." Harlow picked up his wine glass again. "This is the end right here. When Grace mentioned that it was your birthday, we took it on ourselves to handle the proceedings, and just as a little personal aside, let me conclude this way. A toast to Dr. William Stockton, whom I've known for better than 20 years, to all the nice things he's done for a lot of people, and because he's 44 years old, and because we wish him a minimum 44 more to keep being the same kind of guy he is, and the way he's always been. Happy birthday, you old bastard." He took a long swig, and Rebecca Weiss suddenly began to cry. "Oh, my dear God," announced Marty. "Down goes a speech, up come my wife's tears." Bill Stockton blew out the candles, then looked up with a mock sardonic look. "Wow, first a surprise party, and I abhor surprise parties, and then a sloppy, sentimental speech." He turned toward Harlow and held out his hand. "But just between you and me and the American Medical Association, you're nice people to have around, whether you pay your bills or not." He turned and looked down the length of the table and held up his own glass. "May I reciprocate, my friends, to my neighbors, with my thanks that you're in my neighborhood." "Amen," whispered Marty Weiss. "Hey, Pop!" It was Stockton's son, Paul, who came into the dining room. He was a 12-year-old mass of freckles and looked like a pint-sized version of the doctor. "The television set just went out." Stockton held out his hands in dismay. "And how can the world survive without the Untouchables and Huckleberry Hound?" "It was the U.S. Steel Hour," the boy said seriously, "and the picture went out, and then there was some kind of crazy announcement, something about—" He continued to speak, but he was drowned out by Martha Harlow laughing at something Rebecca had said to her. But Marty Weiss, closest to the boy, suddenly looked serious. He got out of his seat and turned to the others. "Hold it, everybody," he said tensely. Then he turned towards the boy. "What did you say, Paul?" "The announcer said something about turning to the Conelrad station on the radio. What does that mean? Hasn't that got something to do with—" He stopped abruptly. There was a sudden absolute stillness. "You must have heard it wrong, Paul," his father said quietly. The boy shook his head. "I didn't hear it wrong, Pop. That's what he said, to turn on your Conelrad station. Then everything went blank." A gasp came from Jerry Harlow. A woman let out a cry. They ran into the living room behind Stockton, who immediately turned the knob on a small table model radio and stared down at it grimly. After a moment, there came the voice of an announcer. "Direct from Washington, D.C., repeating that, 4 minutes ago, the President of the United States made the following announcement. I quote, 'At 11:04 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, both our distant early warning and ballistics early warning lines reported radar evidence of unidentified flying objects flying on a course due southeast. As of this moment, we have been unable to determine the nature of these objects, but for the time being, in the interest of national safety, we are declaring a state of yellow alert.'" There was a moment's silence, and Grace seized the doctor's arm. With her free hand, she reached for Paul and drew him to her. Rebecca Weiss started to cry, and her husband Marty just stood there, his face white. The voice on the radio continued. "The Civil Defense Authorities request that if you have a shelter already prepared, go there at once. If you do not have a shelter, use your time to move supplies, food, water, and medicine to a central place. Keep all windows and doors closed. We repeat, if you're in your home, go to your prepared shelters or to your basement." The voice of the announcer continued, went on, repeating the unbelievable introduction to an incredible horror. They all stood gaping at the radio, and in one fragment of a moment, they thought. "The baby," Rebecca Weiss thought. "My tiny baby asleep in the house across the street. She's only 4 months old." Marty was thinking, "I don't believe it." He rejected it. It simply wasn't happening. It was a magazine story or a movie. It was some idle chatter at a party. It was a pamphlet that some kook had left on the doorstep. But it wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. But all the time he knew it was. It was true. It was happening. "I want to cry," thought Jerry Harlow. "I want to cry. I can feel the tears inside me. But I mustn't cry, I'm a man. But the claims, the insurance claims, my God, they'd be enormous. I could go bankrupt. It was like a joke, a cold, formless joke. Humor in an insane asylum. A crazy accountant trying to add up an earthquake. Oh my God, I'm going to go bankrupt. The world would turn into a jungle. And I'm going to go bankrupt. The roses, Jerry's wife, Martha, thought suddenly. The beautiful American beauties that I've so lovingly and painstakingly cared for. And this year they had come up so beautifully. They were so wonderful. Then she clenched her fists and let her fingernails dig into the flesh of her palms, hating herself for the thought. What about the children? And what about Anne and Charlie? How in God's name could a mother think about a rose garden at this moment when death had just been announced over the radio? She shut her eyes tightly, wishing it all away, but when she opened them, the room was there, and all the people were still in it. She felt a sudden nausea rising up inside her, a wave of sickness that left her weak and perspiring. The pain, Dr. Stockton thought, the incredible pain. I can remember reading about Hiroshima, the burn cases, the radiation poisoning, the scarred, agonized flesh that sent a protracted scream over the dying city. I remember it was something the Japanese doctors could not cope with. It had been too sudden, too unexpected. Agony on a mass scale. This thing that hovers over us now. I don't know how I'm going to deal with it. Millions and millions of people will suddenly be thrust into a maelstrom, a slaughterhouse on a scale that couldn't even be measured by the Holocaust. That was what Hiroshima was like. Is that what this will be like? So each stood there with a secret thought, while the voice of the radio announcer, quivering with a barely perceptible tension, kept on repeating the announcements over and over again in the same dispassionate voice. The well-rehearsed ritual of a modern Paul Revere on a 20th century night ride, one if by land or two if by sea. But there was no opposite shore here. They were all in this together. There was no escape. There was no defense. Death was en route to them, and all anyone could do was simply to announce its coming. They ran out of the Stockton house, frantic, panicky, with vague plans for survival propelling them to their own houses. But then a siren rang out, its eerie shriek piercing the summer night, pinioning their thoughts in the night's darkness, and holding them in fear-frozen suspension until once again they could break loose and race toward their homes. And in each of them, as they ran frantically across the street and down sidewalks and across lawns, was one single awareness, and the siren continued to scream its discordant wail through the summer night. Bill Stockton had placed the radio in the kitchen where Grace was filling water jugs. "This is Conelrad, your emergency broadcasting station. You will find Conelrad at either 640 or 1240 on your dial. Remain tuned in to this frequency. We repeat our previous announcement. We are in a state of yellow alert. If you have a shelter already prepared, go there at once. If you do not have a shelter, use your time to move supplies of food, water, and medicine to a central place. Keep all windows and doors closed. We repeat, if you're in your home, go to your prepared shelters or to your basement." The water dribbled out of the faucet, the pressure growing weaker each moment. Paul hurried through the kitchen, carrying a box of canned goods, and went down the cellar steps. Bill Stockton came into the kitchen after him and picked up 2 of the filled jugs of water on the floor. "Fill up as many as you can, Grace," he said tersely. "I'm going to start the generator up in the shelter in case the power goes off." He looked toward the fluorescent light over the sink. Already it was beginning to dim. Stockton looked grim. "That may happen any moment," he said. "There's hardly any water coming through the tap," Grace said, a catch in her voice. "That's because everybody and his brother is doing the same thing we are. Keep it on full force until it stops." He turned toward the basement door. "Here," Grace called out after him. "Take this one with you. It's filled." She started to remove the heavy jug from the sink. It slipped out of her hand and fell, smashing to the floor and sending glass cascading around the room. Grace let out one sob and shoved a fist into her mouth to hold back any more. For just one moment she felt herself falling into hysteria, wanting to scream, wanting to run frantically somewhere, anywhere, wanting unconsciousness to release her from the nightmare that was going on inside her kitchen. Bill Stockton took hold of her and held her tight. His voice was gentle, but it didn't sound like his voice at all. "Easy, honey, easy." He pointed to the broken jug. "Make believe it's perfume, and it cost $100 an ounce." He stared down at the bottle of water at his feet. "Maybe in an hour," he said thoughtfully, "it'll be worth more than that." Paul came up from the basement. "What else, Pop? All the canned goods down?" "All that I could find." "How about the fruit cellar?" "I put all those in, too," Paul responded. "Get my bag from the bedroom," Stockton said. "Put that down there, too." "What about books and stuff?" Paul said. When Grace spoke, her voice broke, and the words came out tight and loud, louder than her son could ever remember, and different, too. "Damn it! Your father told you to get his bag!" The boy let out an incredulous gasp. It was his mother. He gave a frightened sob. "It's all right," Stockton said softly, pushing the boy out. "We're just frightened, Paul. We're not ourselves. Go ahead, son." Then he turned to his wife. "We'll need books, Grace. God knows how long we'll have to stay down there." Then, in a gentle tone, almost supplicating, "Honey, try to get a hold of yourself. It's the most important thing on God's earth right now." He watched her for a moment, then very deliberately turned to look toward the cupboards to the left of the sink. "What about light bulbs?" he asked. "Where do you keep the light bulbs?" Grace pointed. "Top shelf in that cupboard there." Then she bit her lip. "We don't have any. I ran out yesterday. I was going to buy some at the store. There was a sale on—" She leaned against the sink and felt the tears running down her face. "Oh, my God," she said. "I'm talking like an idiot. There was a sale at the store. Oh, the world is about to explode, and I'm talking about a sale at the store?" Stockton reached out and touched her face. "It doesn't make any difference," he said to her quietly. "You can mouth all the idiocies you want to. Just don't panic, Grace. That's the most important thing now." He held her hand tightly. "We mustn't panic." "How much time do we have?" "There's no telling. I think I remember reading someplace that from the first alarm we might have anywhere from 15 minutes to half an hour." Grace's eyes grew large. 15 minutes? He shook his head. "I'm guessing, Grace. I don't know for sure. I don't think anyone does." He went into the dining room. "Keep getting the water," he said to her over his shoulder. Paul came down the steps through the front hall and into the living room. He carried an armful of books and magazines, and on top of them his father's medical bag. "I got everything, Pop." "Let me give you a hand," said Stockton, taking the things out of his arms. Paul turned and started toward the front door. "Paul!" Stockton shouted at him. "Are you out of your mind? Stay inside here." "My bike's outside," the boy said. "You won't need it. Go on down to the shelter." "But if they do drop a bomb or something, it'll burn everything up. I know, Pop. I read it. If it's a hydrogen bomb, there won't be anything left standing." Stockton let the magazines drop to the floor. He walked over to his son and gripped him by the shoulders. There was a fierceness to his voice. "Don't even think that. Don't let yourself think that. And don't say anything about it in front of your mother. She's counting on us, Paul. We're the men here." He released the boy with one last gentle squeeze. "As a matter of fact, we may be out of the danger zone. We might be 200 or 300 miles from where the bomb drops. We may not even know that it's dropped." "Pop," Paul interrupted, "we're 40 miles from New York. If they dropped a hydrogen bomb—" He looked into his father's eyes. "We'll know it all right, Pop." Stockton stared at this replica of himself. filled with love and pride. "If we do, Paul," he said quietly, "then we do. That's all. But for the time being, our job is to stay alive, and you're not going to stay alive running out in the night trying to find a bicycle." Grace's voice came from the kitchen, shaky and high. "Bill!" She appeared at the dining room door. "Bill, there's no more water." "It doesn't make any difference," Stockton said. "I think we've got enough now anyway. Bring a jug with you, Grace. Paul and I will come back up for the rest of it." They carried the jugs and the rest of the things down the basement steps and through the door of the shelter, which was at the far end of the cellar. Grace put down the jug and looked around the small room. Bunk beds, can-laden shelves, the generator, stacks of books and magazines, medical supplies. Suddenly their whole existence had telescoped into this tiny place loaded with things that up to half an hour ago had had no great significance. Half an hour ago. Grace suddenly recollected that in 30 minutes everything on earth had turned upside down. Every value, every belief, every frame of reference had suddenly ceased to exist or had taken on a vast life or death importance. She watched her husband and Paul leave the shelter and start up the steps toward the kitchen. Stockton stopped halfway up. "I forgot," he said. "There's a 5-gallon can of gasoline in the garage. Paul, you run out and get that. We'll need it for the generator." "Right, Pop." Stockton looked briefly across the cellar towards the open door of the shelter. Grace sat on one of the bunk beds, staring at nothing. He hesitated a moment, then hurried up to the kitchen, picked up 2 of the 3 remaining jugs of water, and went downstairs again. Grace looked up as he entered the shelter. Her voice was a whisper. Bill, this is so incredible. We must be dreaming. It can't really be happening." Stockton knelt down in front of her and took both her hands. "I just told Paul," he said to her, "if it's a bomb, there's no certainty that it'll land near us. And if it doesn't—" Grace pulled her hands away. "But if it does," she said, "if it hits New York, we'll get it, too. All of it. The poison, the radiation. We'll get it." "We'll be in the shelter, Grace," Stockton said, "and with any luck at all, we'll survive. We've got enough food and water to last us at least 2 weeks, maybe even longer, if we use it wisely." Grace looked at him blankly. "Then what, Bill? We'll crawl out of here like gophers to tiptoe through all the rubble up above, the rubble and the ruins and the bodies of our friends?" She stopped and stared down at the floor. When she looked up at him again, there was a different expression on her face, deeper than panic, more enveloping than fear. Resignation, abject surrender. "Why is it so necessary that we survive?" she asked in a flat voice. "What's the good of it, Bill? Wouldn't it be quicker and easier if we just—" She let the word dangle. Paul's voice called, "I got the gasoline, Pop. Is that all you need from out here?" "Bring the can, Paul," his father said. Then he turned to Grace. For the first time there was a tremor in his voice. "That's why we have to survive," he said. "That's the reason." They heard Paul's steps. He may inherit just rubble, but he's 12 years old. It isn't just our survival, Grace. Sure, we can throw our lives away, just deposit them on the curb like garbage cans. His voice went higher. He's 12 years old. It's too early to think about a boy dying when he hasn't even had a chance to do any living. Paul appeared at the door with a gasoline can. "Put it there, next to the generator," Stockton said as he walked out of the room. "I'll go up and get the rest of the water." He climbed back up the stairs to the kitchen and picked up the last of the jugs. He was about to carry it back down when he heard a knock on the kitchen door. Jerry Harlow's face peered through the parted curtains. Stockton unlocked the door. Harlow stood outside with a smile on his face that looked as if it had been painted on. His voice was strained. "How you doing, Bill?" he said. "I'm collecting water, which is what you should be doing." Harlow looked painfully ill at ease. "We got about 30 gallons, and then the water stopped," he said. His face twisted again. "Did yours stop too, Bill?" Stockton nodded. "You better get on home, Jerry. Get into your shelter." He wet his lips and corrected himself. "Into your basement. I'd board up the windows if I were you, and if you've got any wood putty or anything, I'd seal the corners." Harlow fiddled with his tie. "We don't have a cellar, Bill," he said with a lopsided grin. "Remember? The benefits of modern architecture. We've got the one brand new house on the street. Everything at your beck and call. Everything at your fingertips." His voice shook. "Every wonder of modern science taken into account, except the one they forgot." He put his eyes down and stared at his feet. He looked up slowly and swallowed. "Bill," he said in a whisper, "can I bring Martha and the kids over here?" Stockton froze. He felt anger. "Over here?" Harlow nodded eagerly. "We're sitting ducks over there. Sitting ducks. We don't have a basement. We don't have a cellar. We don't have any protection at all." Stockton thought for a moment, then turned away. "You can use our basement." Harlow grabbed his arm. "Your basement?" he asked incredulously. "What about your shelter?" "Damn it, Bill. That's the only place anybody can survive. We've got to get into a shelter." Stockton looked at him, and the anger that had been just a dull resentment surged up inside. He held it down with effort, wondering to himself how the familiar face, once pleasing and boyish, could be so abhorrent to him now. "I don't have any room, Jerry," he said. "I don't have nearly enough room, or supplies, or anything. It's designed for 3 people. "We'll bring our own water," Harlow said eagerly, "and our own food. We'll sleep on top of one another if necessary." His voice broke. "Please, Bill." He stared at Stockton's impassive face. "Bill, we've got to use your shelter," he cried. "I've got to keep my family alive, and we won't use any of your stuff. Don't you understand? We'll bring our own." Stockton looked down at Harlow's hands, then into his face. "What about your own air? Will you bring your own air? That's a 10 by 10 room, Jerry." Harlow let his hands drop. "Just let us stay in there the first 48 hours or so. Then we'll get out. Honest to God, Bill, no matter what, we'll get out." Stockton felt the water jug heavy in his hand. This could not be prolonged. He knew that. His voice cut through the air like a scalpel. "When that door gets closed, Jerry, it stays closed. Closed and locked. There'll be radiation, and God knows what else." He felt an anguish rising deep inside him. "I'm sorry, Jerry. As God is my witness, I'm sorry, but I built that for my family." He turned and started for the basement. Jerry's voice followed him. "What about my family? What do we do? Just rock on the front porch until we get burned to cinders?" Stockton kept his back to him. "That's not my concern. Right at this moment, it's my family I have to worry about." He started down the steps. Harlow ran after him and grabbed his arm. "I'm not going to sit by and watch my wife and my kids die in agony." Tears rolled down Harlow's face. "Do you understand, Bill? I'm not going to do that." He shook Stockton and started to cry uncontrollably. "I'm not going to—" Stockton pulled away. The jug slipped out of his hand and bounced down the basement steps, but it did not break. Stockton went slowly down the steps and picked it up. "I'm sorry," he heard Harlow say. "Please forgive me, Bill." Stockton turned to look up. "Oh, my God," he thought. "That's my friend standing there. That's my friend." But then his anger returned. He spoke to the figure standing above him. "I kept telling you, all of you, build a shelter. Get ready. Forget the card parties and the barbecues for maybe a couple of hours a week and admit to yourself that the worst is possible. I told you all to build a shelter." He shook his head. But you didn't want to listen, Jerry. None of you wanted to listen. To build a shelter was admitting the kind of age we're living in, and none of you had the guts to make that kind of an admission." He closed his eyes for a moment and then took a deep breath. "So now, Jerry, now you've got to face the reality." He took one last look at the white, stricken face on the stairs. "You want help now, Jerry? Now you get it from God." He shook his head. "Not from me." He walked across the cellar toward the shelter. The front door opened and the Weisses hurried through the hall into the living room. Rebecca carried their baby in her arms and stayed close to Marty. "Bill!" Marty called. "Bill, where are you?" "They're already in the shelter," Rebecca cried hysterically. "I told you they'd be in the shelter. They've locked themselves in." Jerry Harlow appeared from the kitchen. "It's no use," he said. "He won't let anyone in." Marty's dark little face twisted with fear. "He's got to let us in." He pointed toward Rebecca and the baby. "We don't even have any windows in half the basement. I don't have anything to plug them up with either." He started to push his way past Harlow. "Where is he? Is he downstairs? Is he in the shelter?" He walked through the dining room into the kitchen, saw the open basement door, and called down, "Bill! Bill, it's Marty. We've got the baby with us." He stumbled down the cellar steps, calling, "Bill! Bill!" The lights dimmed in the basement, and Marty groped his way across the cellar floor until he reached the metal door of the shelter, now closed. Behind him, in the darkness, his wife's voice called out, "Marty! Marty, where are you? The lights are out. Marty, please, please come back and get us." The baby started to cry, and then from outside came the sound of the siren. Marty pounded on the door of the shelter. "Bill, please, Bill, let us in." Stockton's voice came back, muffled, from the other side of the door. "Marty, I would if I could. Do you understand? If it didn't mean endangering the lives of my own family, I would. I swear to you, I would." The last part of his words were drowned out by the siren, and then by the shrill wailing of the baby from the steps. Panic clawed at Marty, and he pounded on the door with both hands. "Bill," he shouted, "you've got to let us in. There isn't any time. Please, Bill." On the other side of the door, the generator had begun to hum, and the lights went on in the shelter. 2 big 100-watt bulbs, glaringly white. Bill Stockton put his head against the steel door and closed his eyes. He shook his head. "I can't, Marty. Don't stay there asking me. I can't." His mouth went tight and his voice shook. "I can't, and I won't." Marty Weiss knew then that the door was to remain locked. He turned and peered through the darkness at the figure of his wife standing on the steps. He felt a surge of tenderness, of love, and, at this moment, of a loss, final and irrevocable. He turned and stared at the closed door. "I feel sorry for you, Bill," he said, quietly but clearly. "I really do. You'll survive. You'll live through it." His voice went higher. "But you're going to have blood on your hands. Do you hear me, Bill? You'll have blood on your hands." Inside the shelter, Stockton stared at his wife. She tried to say something to him, but nothing came out. Stockton could hear Marty Weiss's footsteps retreating through the cellar and up the steps. His hands shook, and he had to clasp them together to keep them still. "I can't help it," he whispered. "It's us or it's them. All my life, I've only had one function. That was to end suffering, relieve pain, to cure. But the rules are different now. The rules, the time, the place. Now there's only one purpose, Grace. That's to survive. Nothing else means anything. And we can't afford to let it mean anything. Suddenly, he whirled to the door. "Marty, Jerry," he screamed, "all of you, any of you, get out of here. Stay out of here." Behind him, he could hear his son beginning to cry. "Damn it! Damn it! If there's blood on my hands, all of you put it there." And then he began to tremble. Fatigue struck him like a blow. He felt as if he could no longer stand up, and he sat down on one of the cots. Far off, there was the sound of the siren. Bill Stockton closed his eyes tightly and tried to make his mind go blank, but the sound persisted, and he felt a massive pain. A group of neighbors collected outside Bill Stockton's house. One of them carried a portable radio, and the voice of the Conelrad announcer supplied an urgent background to the whispered questions and the occasional cry of a child or a woman. Harlow came out from the house and stood on the front porch. Marty Weiss and his wife followed him. Martha Harlow pushed her way through the group, holding tight to the hands of her children. "Jerry," she called toward the porch. "What happened?" Harlow shook his head. "Nothing happened. I think we all better go back and try to fix up the cellars." "That's crazy," a man's voice said. "There's no time for that. Bill's got the only place on the street that would do any good." A woman cried out, "It's going to land any minute." Her voice was frantic. "I know it. It's going to land any minute." "This is Conelrad," the radio announced. "This is Conelrad. We are still in a state of yellow alert. If you are a public official or a government employee with an emergency assignment or a civil defense worker, you should report to your post immediately. If you are a public official or a government employee..." The voice continued underneath the flood of voices. A big burly man who lived on the corner started up the steps to Stockton's porch. Jerry Harlow stood in his way. "Don't waste your time," Harlow said. "He won't let anyone in." The man turned helplessly toward his wife, who stood at the foot of the steps. "What'll we do?" the woman asked, panic building in her voice. "What are we going to do?" "Maybe we ought to pick out just one basement," Marty Weiss said, "and go to work on it. Pool all our stuff. Food, water, everything." "It isn't fair," Martha Harlow said. She pointed toward the Stockton porch. "He's down there in a bomb shelter, completely safe, and our kids have to just wait around for a bomb to drop." Her 9-year-old daughter began to cry, and Martha knelt down to hold her tightly. The big man on the porch steps turned to survey the group. "I think we'd better just go down into his basement, break down the door." In the sudden silence, the siren wailed shrilly across the night, and the 10 or 12 people seemed to draw closer to one another. Another man took a step out from the group. "Henderson's right," he said. "There isn't any time to argue or anything else. We've just got to go down there and get in." A chorus of voices agreed with him. The big man walked down the steps and started around the yard toward the garage. Harlow shouted at him, "Wait a minute!" He raced down the steps. "Damn it, wait a minute! We all wouldn't fit in there. It'd be crazy to even try." Marty Weiss's voice called out plaintively, "Why don't we draw lots? Pick out one family." "What difference would it make?" Harlow said. "He won't let us in." Henderson, the big man, looked unsure for a moment. "We could all march down there," he said, "and tell him he's got the whole street against him. We could do that." Again, voices agreed with him. Harlow pushed his way through the group to stand near Henderson. "What the hell good would that do?" he asked. "I keep telling you, even if we were to break down the door, it wouldn't accommodate all of us. We'd just be killing everybody, and for no reason." Mrs. Henderson's voice broke in. "If it saves even one of these kids out here, I'd call that a reason." Again, a murmur of assent came. "Jerry," Marty Weiss said, "you know him better than any of us. You're his best friend. Why don't you go down again? Try to talk to him, plead with him. Tell him to pick out one family, draw lots or something." Henderson took a long stride over to Marty. "One family? Meaning yours, Weiss, huh?" Marty whirled around toward him. "Well, why not? Why the hell not? I've got a 4-month-old baby." "What difference does that make?" the big man's wife said. "Is your baby's life any more precious than our kids'?" Marty Weiss turned to her. "I never said that. If you're going to start trying to argue about who deserves to live more than the next one—" "Why don't you shut your mouth, Weiss?" Henderson shouted at him. In wild, illogical anger, he turned to the others. "That's the way it is when the foreigners come over here. Pushy, grabby semi-Americans." Marty's face went white. "Why, you garbage-brained idiot, there's always one person, one rotten, unthinking crumb, who suddenly has to become the #1 big straw boss and decide what ancestry is acceptable that season." A man at the back shouted, "It still goes, Weiss. If we've got to start hunting around for some people to disqualify, you and yours could go to the top of the list." "Oh, Marty," Rebecca sobbed, feeling a surge of a different type of fear. Weiss threw off her restraining arm and started to push his way through the crowd to the man who had spoken. Jerry Harlow had to step between them. "Keep it up, both of you," he said tightly. "Just keep it up, and we won't even need a bomb. We can just slaughter each other." "Marty," Rebecca Weiss's voice came from the darkness near the porch. "Please, go down to Bill's shelter again. Ask him." Marty turned to her. "I've already asked him. It won't do any good." There was the sound of the siren again, this time closer, and far off in the distance, a stabbing searchlight probed the night sky. The Conelrad announcer's voice came up again, and they heard him repeating the same yellow alert announcement as before. "Mommy, Mommy," a little girl's voice quavered. "I don't want to die, Mommy. I don't want to die." Henderson looked at the child, then started to walk toward the garage. Gradually, in little groups, the neighbors followed him. "I'm going down there," he announced as he walked, "and get him to open that door. I don't care what the rest of you think. That's the only thing left to do." Another man called out, "He's right. Come on, let's do it." They were no longer walking. Now they were a running, jostling group, and Jerry Harlow, watching them run past him, suddenly noticed that in the moonlight all their faces looked the same: wild eyes, tight, grim-set mouths, an aura of pushing, driving ferocity. They slammed their way through the garage, and Henderson kicked open the door leading to the basement. Like a mob of fanatics, they shouted their way into the basement. Henderson pounded his fist on the sheltered door. "Bill! Bill Stockton! You've got a bunch of your neighbors out here who want to stay alive. Now you can open that door and talk to us and figure out with us how many can come in there, or else you can just keep doing what you're doing and we'll bust our way in." They all shouted in agreement. On the other side of the door, Grace Stockton grabbed her son and held him tight. Stockton stood close to the door, for the first time unsure and frightened. Again he heard the pounding, this time by many fists. "Come on, Stockton!" a voice called from the other side. "Open up!" Then there was the familiar voice of Jerry Harlow. "Bill, this is Jerry. They mean business out here." Stockton wet his lips. "And I mean business in here," he said. "I've already told you, Jerry, you're wasting your time. You're wasting precious time that could be used for something else, like figuring out how you're going to survive." Again Henderson smashed at the door with a heavy fist and felt the unyielding metal. He turned to look at his neighbors. "Why don't we get some kind of battering ram?" he suggested. "That's right," another man said. "We could go over to Bennett Avenue. Phil Klein has a bunch of 2x4s in his basement. I've seen them." A woman's protesting voice, somehow petulant and ugly, broke in. "That would get him into the act," her voice said. "And who cares about saving him? The minute we do that, then we'd let all those other people know that there's a shelter on this street. Soon we'd have a whole mob to contend with, a whole bunch of outsiders." "Sure," Mrs. Henderson agreed. "And what right do they have to come over here? This isn't their street. This isn't their shelter." Jerry Harlow stared from one silhouette to another and wondered what insane logic possessed them all. "This is our shelter, huh?" he cried fiercely. "And on the next street, that's a different country? You idiots! You damn fools! You're all insane now, all of you!" "Maybe you don't want to live," Rebecca Weiss's voice cried out. "Maybe you don't care, Jerry." "I do care," Harlow said to her. "Believe me, I care. I'd like to see the morning come too, but you've become a mob, and a mob doesn't have any brains, and that's what you're proving. That's what you're proving right at this moment, that you don't have any brains." Henderson's voice spoke, harsh, loud. "I say, let's get a battering ram," he shouted like a cheerleader, "and we'll just tell Klein to keep his mouth shut as to why we want it." "I agree with Jerry." Marty Weiss's voice was tentative and diffident. "Let's get a hold of ourselves. Let's stop and think for a minute." Henderson turned to face Weiss's small, dark form. "Nobody cares what you think," he spitted out. "You or your kind. I thought I made it clear upstairs. I think the first order of business is to get you out of here." He moved in on Marty and lashed out with the force of his 200 pounds. His fist smashed against Marty Weiss's cheek, and Marty fell backward, landing first against a woman, then stumbling against a child, and finally winding up on his back. His wife screamed and started running toward him, and the whole dark basement echoed and re-echoed with the sound of angry shouts and frightened cries, sparked by the wail of a terror-stricken child. "Come on!" Henderson's bull voice carried over the noise. "Let's go get something to smash this door down." They were a mob, and they moved like a mob. Fear had become fury. Panic had become resolve. They stormed out of the basement onto the street. Each was willing to follow his neighbor. Each was content to let someone else lead. And while they marched wildly down the street, the voice of the Conelrad announcer darted like a thin, menacing needle in and out of their consciousness. "We have been asked to remind the population once again," the announcer's voice said, "that they are to remain calm, stay off the streets. This is urgent. Please remain off the streets. Everything possible is being done in the way of protection, but the military cannot move, and important civil defense vehicles must have the streets clear. So once again, you're reminded to stay off the streets. Remain off the streets." But the crowd continued down the block. They were not listening to the words that the radio said. There was an emergency, and the radio made it official. Less than 5 minutes later, they were back in front of Stockton's house. They had found a long board, and 6 men were carrying it. They took it into the garage, breaking a window in the door as they entered. Then they used it to smash the door into the basement. They carried it through the basement over to the shelter door and began to pound against it. The shelter door was thick, but not thick enough. The weight of the board, with 6 big men at it, first dented and then punctured the metal. And once the first rip appeared, others followed it until, within moments, the top hinge had been smashed away and the door began to buckle. Inside, Bill Stockton tried to pile cots, a chair, other furniture, and finally the generator against it, but with each smashing, resounding blow, the barricade was pushed back. The door finally gave and crashed into the shelter. The impetus of the final blow carried board and men into the room, and the side of the board grazed Stockton's head, tearing out a chunk of flesh. Suddenly, everyone was silent, and over this sudden silence came the sound of the siren, a long, piercing blast, which gradually died away, and then the voice of the radio announcer came on again. "This is Conalrad," the announcer's voice said. "Remain tuned for an important message." There was a silence for a moment, and then the voice continued. "The President of the United States has just announced that the previously unidentified objects have now been definitely identified as being satellites. Repeat, there are no enemy missiles approaching. Repeat, there are no enemy missiles approaching. The objects have been identified as satellites. They are harmless, and we are in no danger. Repeat, we are in no danger. The state of yellow alert has been canceled. We are in no danger. Repeat, there is no enemy attack. There is no enemy attack." His voice continued, the words at first having no sense to the listeners, then gradually taking on form and meaning. And then men turned to look at their wives and slowly took them in their arms. Small children buried their faces against trousered and skirted legs. There were some sobs, some murmured prayers. The lights came on again in the streets and houses, and the men and women stared at one another. "Thank God," Rebecca Weiss's voice was a prayer for them all. "Oh, thank God." She leaned against Marty, only vaguely aware that his lip was torn and bleeding. "Amen," said Marty. "Amen." Henderson kept staring at his big hands as if they were something he had never seen. Then he swallowed and turned to Weiss. "Hey, Marty," he said softly with a thin smile. "Marty, I went off my rocker. You understand that, don't you? I just went off my rocker. I didn't mean all the things I said." His voice shook. We were so scared. We were just confused." He waved his hands helplessly. "Well, it's no wonder, and really, is it? I mean, well, you can understand why we blew our tops a little." There was a murmur of voices, a few perfunctory nods, but the state of shock was still on them. Jerry Harlow left the basement steps and walked to the center of the cellar. "I don't think Marty's going to hold it against you." He turned toward Stockton, who stood motionless at the entrance to the shelter. "Just as I hope Bill won't hold this against us," Harlow continued, pointing to the wreckage and rubble around him. "We'll pay for the damage, Bill. We'll take up a collection right away." Marty Weiss wiped the blood off of his mouth. "Why don't we have some kind of block party or something tomorrow night?" he said. "A big celebration. How about it? Just like old times." The people stared at him. "So we can, all of us, get back to normal," he continued. "How about it, Bill?" Every eye turned to Stockton, who stood there silently looking at them. Harlow dredged up a laugh. "Hey, Bill, I told you we'd pay for the damages. I'll put that in writing if you want." The silence persisted as Stockton stepped over the broken door and walked into the basement area. He looked around him, as if trying to find someone in particular. He felt the throbbing at the side of his head as he walked past the faces of neighbors. Their eyes followed him as he went on over to the cellar steps. "Bill," Harlow whispered. "Hey, Bill." Stockton turned to him. "That's all it takes, huh?" He looked at Marty Weiss. "Marty," he said, "you want a block party? And you want things back to normal? And Frank Henderson over there, he wants us all to forget all about it, chalk it up to a bad scare. And Jerry, you'll pay for the damages, huh? You'll even put it in writing? You'll pay for the damages." Harlow nodded silently. Stockton looked slowly around the room. "Do any of you have any remote idea what the damages are?" He paused. "Let me tell you something. They're more than that broken door over there, and they're a lot deeper than the bruises on Marty Weiss's face, and you don't wipe them out by throwing a block party, or 100 block parties, every night of the year." He saw his wife step out of the shelter, and then his son Paul. They were staring at him with the others, the same questioning look, the same beaten and somehow haunted look. Stockton put his hand on the railing. "The damages I'm talking about," he said, "are the pieces of ourselves that we've pulled apart tonight. The veneer, the thin veneer that we ripped aside with our own hands. The hatred that came to the surface that we didn't realize we had. But oh man, how quick it came out, and how quickly we became animals, all of us." He pointed to himself. "Me too. Maybe I was the worst of the bunch. I don't know." He paused for a moment and looked around. "I don't think it'll be normal again, at least not in our lifetime. And if, God forgive, that bomb does fall, I hope we've made our peace before we suffer it. I hope that if it has to kill and destroy and maim, the victims will be human beings, not naked wild beasts who put such a premium on staying alive that they claw their neighbors to death just for the privilege." He shook his head and then, very slowly, turned to look up toward the kitchen. "That's what the damage has been," he said. "It's having to look at ourselves in a mirror and see what's underneath the skin, and suddenly realizing that underneath we're an ugly race of people." He went up the steps, and after a moment, Grace, holding tight to Paul's hand, moved through the silent people and followed him. The silence stretched to a long moment, and then gradually, by twos and threes, the neighbors started out of the basement, through the garage, and onto the street. The street lights were bright, and the moon was up and high and full. A radio that had been left on blared out dance band music. A television set once again uttered the canned laughter of a manufactured audience. A child cried, but was crooned to and hushed. It was any summer night again. There was the sound of the crickets. There was the croaking rumble of a distant bullfrog. There was a gentle wind that touched the broad leaves with a rustling sound and sent patches of shadow crisscrossing on the sidewalks. Bill Stockton stood in the dining room. At his feet was the remnant of the birthday cake lying on its side. A few broken candles, snuffed out, lay in a crumble of frosting, and he thought that for humanity to survive, the human race must remain civilized. Funny, he thought, as he walked past the smashed, overturned furniture. Really quite funny how a simple thing like that could have eluded him. He took his wife's hand, and then Paul's, and the three of them started up the stairs to their beds. The night had ended.